Welcome to another episode of the Secular Buddhism podcast. This is episode number 62. I am your host, Noah Rochetta, and today I'm sharing the audio of a discussion I had with Frank Ostaseski on the topic of death. Death is perhaps our greatest teacher. It's awareness of death that can be said to be the secret to life, the secret to living life fully. And Frank is an expert on the topic. He's a Buddhist teacher, an international lecturer, and a leading voice in end-of-life care. He co-founded the Zen Hospice Project, which was the first Buddhist hospice in America, and he created the Metta Institute to provide innovative educational programs and professional trainings that foster compassionate, mindfulness-based care. He's the author of a book called The 5 Invitations, Discovering What Death Can Teach Us About Fully Living. And I've been excited to interview him because the topic of death is perhaps, as I mentioned before, one of the most powerful topics that we can approach when it comes to trying to live more mindfully. I don't know of a single thing that can trigger a more profound shift of perspective than having a close encounter with death, whether that be on a personal note, a close encounter with death, or encountering, a loved one, finding out a loved one has cancer, or finding out that a loved one just lost someone that they care about. Anytime we encounter death, it seems to be the most impactful and profound change that we experience. It's in those moments that we are keenly aware of just how fragile life is, that we become very mindful about what really matters. And oftentimes we find in those moments that the things that we thought that really mattered don't. And the things that we kind of discard and don't think they really matter, we find out those are the things that really do matter. It kind of has a tendency to flip things upside down almost. And I've been wanting to have a discussion on this topic because I think it is a profound topic. And unfortunately, death is something that we don't think about or talk about very often in our society. And I understand why. I think, it makes us sad. And at the core of everything that Buddhism teaches is this premise that where there is discomfort, we run from it. We don't want to talk about it. We don't want to think about it because it's not comfortable. And I love how the Buddhist approach is saying the opposite. It's saying, well, wait a second. This is perhaps the only certain thing that we have in life. Why not look towards it? Why not use death as an ongoing way of living fully, of living more mindfully? And several years ago, I tried this experiment myself to think about death often, not just my own death, but the death of the people closest to me, the people that I love and care about. And it is uncomfortable, but over time, it's settled into this sense of reality. I know that I'm going to lose everyone that I care about. I know when I interact with people out on the street that they're not going to live forever. I'm not going to live forever. And it has the ability to change the way that we interact with people. It has the ability to help us to not get so bent out of shape over things, because we start to see the impermanent nature of life and the impermanent nature of every single moment. This moment passes away so that a new moment arises. And it's life-changing to think this way. And that's why I wanted to share this topic. And Frank is the best person to have this discussion with. In his book, The 5 Invitations, he talks about 5 specific invitations that you can apply to your life to to start to see death differently. We discussed that a little bit in the interview, but I would invite you to pick up his book, The Five Invitations, and to read that. And then hopefully, as strange as it sounds, I would invite you to think about death often. The death, your death and the death of everyone that you know. And like I said, with time, this can become a profound way of living very mindfully. The Buddha's greatest teaching is the teaching of impermanence, and death is the ultimate expression of this teaching. Everything that is familiar to us ceases. And I think that awareness of death is the secret to living mindfully. It's when we're reminded how fragile life is, that's when we become aware of how precious every single moment is, whether it be a pleasant moment or an unpleasant moment. So with that as the background, I hope you enjoy this discussion that I had with Frank Ostaseski. Without further ado, I give you the audio recording of the interview I had with Frank. Thank you. Okay, this interview is being streamed live now across the Secular Buddhism Facebook page, YouTube channel, and probably a few other places. So what I do at the end of this interview, I failed to mention this to you a second ago, I'll take the audio. The audio will be uploaded to the podcast, but the video, the raw video of the interview will reside on the Facebook page where followers of the Facebook page or group can watch it later if they didn't see it live.
Great. Just send me a link to it. We'll bring our people to it as well.
All right. Well, those of you who are watching or listening live, welcome. I am very excited to have Frank Ostaseski with me and to have a lively discussion on the topic of death today. And it sounds a little humorous at times to speak lightly of death. And at the same time, I do want to emphasize the fact that from my perspective, the teaching of impermanence in Buddhism is perhaps the most powerful, transformative teaching. The idea that at any given moment, a moment passes away to give rise to a new moment, and then extending that thought all the way onto this experience of being alive and the ever-present thought of this experience ending can be very profound. And Frank is one of the experts on this topic. He's a Buddhist teacher, an international lecturer, and a leading voice in end-of-life care. In 1987, he co-founded the Zen Hospice Project, the first Buddhist hospice in America. In 2004, he created the Metta Institute to provide innovative and educational programs and professional trainings that foster compassion, mindfulness-based care. And he's the author of a book called The Five Invitations, which I happened to read earlier this year, and then recently listened to him talking about the topic of death and his book on another podcast, on Sam Harris's podcast. And I'm a big fan of Sam Harris's podcast. And I thought it would be really cool to invite him onto the Secular Buddhism podcast. And he very graciously accepted the invitation. And that's why he's here today. So we're going to talk about discovering what death can teach us about fully living. So thank you very much, Frank, for taking the time to join us today.
No, I'm really happy to be with you, and happy to also be with the viewers and listeners that will be taking advantage of this, I hope. And yeah, I like that we're going to sort of emphasize the living part. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, what can death teach us about living a full life? Yeah. Living a life characterized by love and
absolutely
meaning and purpose. Yeah.
So it seems to me, and anyone listening would probably agree, if you've ever had a brush with death, a family member or a loved one either passing away or almost passing away, it changes you. You start, death seems to be the teacher that can at any given moment just radically shift your priorities, radically shift your perspective. Everything changes in the face of death. And it's not necessarily that we have to wait for that final moment when we realize, uh-oh, I'm about to pass away. We get glimpses of this when we find out a good friend passed away, or a friend's cousin, or anytime we brush with death, it seems to trigger something in us, a more mindful way of living, and then it seems to wear off, and with time we kind of forget, and then we're reminded again of our mortality, right? And we're right back at it, where suddenly priorities shift. So with your work, you seem to be you're immersed in this all the time. So let's talk a little bit about how transformative that experience is, being regularly reminded of death. How does that change the day-to-day living, the living part of this experience?
Well, it's a great question, and the scenario that you paint is quite a common one, right? We have some encounter, and then we kind of spring back into our old habits. I mean, we think death is something that will happen later, and later gives us that comfortable buffer between, where we are in this moment and when we think death will happen at the end of some long road, for example, or a long illness. But, I talk about death as being the secret teacher that is hiding in plain sight, showing us what matters most, helping us to really appreciate how to step into this life. And I don't think we have to wait until even to our own dying, certainly, or even to a brush with death to understand something about that. It's all the time here. It's not just when we step off a curb and a car narrowly misses us. It's reading the newspaper, or watching the evening news, or, as you say, friends of friends coming in, having an encounter with loss. It's not just that death comes and then it reminds us of life. It's more that we start stepping into the every day, every moment coming and going of life. And when we do that, when we recognize it's totally precarious, I mean, it's all precarious, then I think it also helps us to appreciate how precious it is. And then we don't want to waste a moment, That's what I find to be really useful about this experience, that it shows us we're all in the boat together. And I think this engenders us being kinder to one another.
Yeah, absolutely. Isn't it fascinating that death is perhaps the most certain thing we have? We're so uncomfortable with uncertainty in life. We chase after things to try to have a sense of control, a sense of certainty, and yet here it is, glaring almost in front of us, the certainty of our death, and the death of everything we hold dear, everyone that we know, and yet we seem to never want to think about it. Why do you think that is? At least in our society, why is it so taboo to think about the death of a loved one, or to why?
Well, I mean, I think that this has been our training since we were very young, to see death as the enemy, as a final curtain call, all that stuff, and instead, really, what would happen if we began to speak with our youngsters, our children, more about death in it? I think actually, in my experience, kids are really fascinated by this. They really want to know about it, and they're not scared of it at all. It's just that we've told ourselves really scary stories about death. So that's happening, but it's also changing. I think that, we've removed death from everyday life oftentimes in our experience, and that's part of what makes it foreign. And we made it technological, and we've mystified it, and we've, turned it over to doctors and priests and undertakers. And I think when we do that, we rob ourselves really of connection with the holy significance of death, really. So I think it's shifting. I think people are wanting to have this conversation more and more. They just don't know how to have it. And they want to have it with people who aren't so afraid to talk about it.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we're doing today. We're just having an honest conversation about it. So I think there has been this traditionally, all of this avoidance and taboos, et cetera, but that's a relatively new phenomenon. We have to really think, and we think in terms of the history of the humankind. This is something that's decades old.
Yeah. Yeah. Something I've really appreciated from the Buddhist perspective, rather than seeing life as this force opposed by death as its opposite, the Buddhist approach really meshes the two, and it helps you to get out of that dualistic way of thinking of life and death, and then you see it as life death. It's like the same. You can't have one without the other. And that that mental approach for me was a pretty radical shift to realize um, that you should, if you love life, why should you hate death, right? Because you can't have one without the other. And I was having a conversation with my son, who's 8 years old. We were driving, and he was asking
Uh,
me, I don't remember exactly how the topic came up, but we were talking about death. And I said, what if instead of talking about it like death, like the end, we just realize it's a continuation. And I started to give him examples. I said, the death of winter is the birth of what? And I mean, right away is like spring. Yeah, and the death of
mm,
spring is the birth of what? And when we started going through this process, we talked about caterpillars. What is the death of a caterpillar? It's the birth of a butterfly. And so everything in the context of the end of something is the start of something else. And I think that was very profound for him. And then he came up with scenarios, and some were comical, but it was, the death of a cow is the birth of a hamburger, or things like that. And I was saying, this is what I wanted him to grasp, is continuation.
yeah,
It doesn't,
yeah.
it doesn't spell the end in the sense of non-existence. It's transformation. And I thought that was really neat, and it was fun to have that conversation with him.
Yeah, it's a beautiful way to have a conversation with a child, and to really listen also to what they think about it,
Hmm.
as opposed to us telling them all the time what it should be.
Yeah.
I used to run a preschool years ago when my son was quite young. He's a grown adult with his own children now. But we used to have these days in the preschool where we go out into the woods, the nearby woods, and find dead stuff.
Hmm.
The kids loved it.
Yeah.
They'd go out and they'd find a rusty old car part, or a twig, or a leaf, or um, bones of a bird, and we bring them all back and spread them out on a blue tarp, and then we'd have a kind of show and tell, and the kids would talk about what they'd seen, and they were incredibly imaginative. I mean, they would talk about this piece of bark had been a bed for a mouse, and the mouse didn't need it anymore. This rusty old car part was a part of a spaceship that had fallen from as it passed over the earth. And then this one little girl said something beautiful. She said, I think the leaves on the trees are very, very generous, that they fall to make room for new leaves. I thought that was a beautiful understanding, from this 4-year-old, really.
Hmm.
And I think if we can have conversations like the one you were having with your son, or the one I'm describing with children early on, instead of frightening them, I think it really makes a huge difference in how we grow up, in keeping death as our companion in a way.
Hmm.
And we learn then how to harness an awareness of death to appreciate the fact that we're really alive, to encourage self-exploration, to clarify our values, to find meaning, to generate positive action in our life.
Yeah.
I think it's impermanence that gives us perspective. It helps us to appreciate the beauty of life.
Yeah, absolutely. So your first invitation in the book is to not wait, right? That we don't need to wait to have these conversations. And one of the things that stood out to me when I first thought about not waiting was also not waiting to think about all the scenarios that could happen. I first came across this concept years ago, reading another book. But I remember having the thought, what would it be like if I lost when I lose my parents? It's a thought that I had avoided. I'm a twin brother, and we're very close. And that was another thought.
Mm,
What would it be like to not have my twin brother? And that was, it hit on emotions that I didn't want to explore yet. And that sense of not waiting for me was realizing, well, why not explore that now? What would it feel like to not have him in my life? And it made every moment more precious since that thought
mm,
experiment, because it's like, oh, I still have him, and I still have my
mm,
mom, and I still have my dad, right? So the idea of not waiting, I think, can be beneficial also in terms of not waiting to think of what it will be like when we don't have the people that we currently have. Do you find that as a thought experiment, is that, I mean, it can be difficult, right? No one likes to think of the loss of their loved ones, but once you do you get used to it the more you
mm.
practice it? What do you find with this thought?
Well, I mean, I think that it's an interesting exercise to do, as you're suggesting, and it can be just kept as a kind of thought experiment. And that keeps us in safe territory, so to speak.
Mhm.
I think it's really important that we let that drop into our heart and into our bones and really know it to be true. It is true. It's a fact of life that all those who are dear to us, we will be separated from. That's inevitable.
Mhm.
So at first, this is a scary thought, and it brings up this kind of urgency. And but that urgency isn't all bad. It also is a reminder to really step in with both feet into our life, right? To tell the people we love that we love them now,
Mhm.
you know, not to wait for some other opportunity for that.
Mhm.
And again, I think it's the precariousness of this life that helps us to appreciate its beauty. I mean, every year cherry blossoms explode on the hillsides of Japan, right? There's a beautiful place where I teach in the Northwest where there are these little blue flax flowers that last for a single day.
Hmm.
Now, how come those flowers are so much more beautiful than plastic flowers? Huh?
Mhm.
Isn't it part of the fact that they have a brief life? The brevity of their lives help us to appreciate their beauty.
Yeah.
So it's not that it's all sad. It's that it is really about really fully stepping into our life. I think that um, don't wait is a reminder that waiting for the next moment to arrive, we miss this one.
Mhm.
You know, I've been with hundreds and hundreds of families, who have said to me in one way or another, when is mom going to die? And waiting for the moment of death, we miss all the moments in between.
Mhm.
You know, so I think it's not that it should create a panic in us, but it's like, don't fool around. Don't fool yourself into believing you have endless time. You know, that's a ridiculous, I say to imagine at the time of your death, you will have the clarity of mind, the, emotional stability, the physical strength to do the work of a lifetime is a ridiculous gamble.
Mhm.
Let's not wait
Mhm.
for that. Why? Let's do it now.
Yeah.
Let's really step into our life, both feet.
I
Yeah.
found what you just mentioned, the passing of a moment. Um, the so this thought experiment for me that started with people, with loved ones,
Hmm.
transitioned into an almost constant thought of the passing of a moment. And I
Mm.
catch myself in moments or in phases or in stages of life, anticipating what is the next one. And one moment that I had that I still consider to be one of the more special or precious moments I had with my youngest, who's 2 right now, was
Mm.
the process of changing a stinky diaper with her, and the thought occurring to me that it'll be so nice when she's out of diapers. And it seemed to have the process happened so quickly that when I realized the stage will come when diapers will no longer be a part of my life, and I'll look back and not that I would long for that, but I'll look back with, fond memories of the stage of a toddler running around in diapers. And I thought, why am I in such a rush to move past this phase? And whatever the next one is, I'm going to be rushed to get past that one. And before you know it, all those stages are gone and they're not even at home anymore. And like I said, all that happened pretty quickly while I was still changing the diaper, but it changed the experience of changing the diaper. It became a
Mm.
precious moment that I thought, this is what I get to do right now. Um,
Mm.
and that
Oh,
was one
beautiful.
way that it kind of manifested for me, this idea.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's, the great value of having elders in our culture, and we've lost a little bit of the wisdom of elders, I think, oriented. Um, and so living in our sort of ghettos, our youth
Hmm.
ghettos, so to speak. Um, so I think that there's something, there's a wisdom that grows with age. Not all old people are wise. I don't mean to suggest that, but there is something about slowing down. And it's not just because the body gets old and crotchety, it's that you start to see it goes by
Hmm.
really fast. And so it's not like it's just what I want to encourage is stepping into it, really enjoying it,
Hmm.
fully, you know, not tasting it all. For me, that's the most life affirming thing that I know is being with people who are dying. Looking into their eyes, they're clear mirrors, and they really show me where I'm holding, to my fear and to my opinions and
Hmm.
views. You know, and they also show me something else. They show me what I sometimes call an undying love. A love that isn't particular just to a single human being and doesn't come and go with every moment. Something that's steady. Something is always coming together and falling apart. Everything. This morning's breakfast, where did it go? Last night's lovemaking, where is it? My blonde hair, it's gone, right? It used to be there, it's not there anymore. So I could grieve all of that experience, and sometimes it's necessary to do that. Or I could recognize this is the way of things.
Yeah.
And I could appreciate that coming and going is happening, we could say, against a background of perfect harmony. Yeah. And when we don't see the background, we only see the coming and going, I think what happens is all we see is suffering, So it's really important to see all this is happening against a background of perfect harmony. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And we miss that oftentimes.
Yeah.
We're so busy. We spend so much of our day planning for the next moment, right? Yeah. Or, trying to distract ourselves from the current moment, in some fashion or another.
Yeah.
But I think embracing the truth that things will inevitably change encourages us not to wait, in order to start living our life in a manner that's really deeply engaging. We stop wasting our time on meaningless activities. We don't hold our opinions or our desires or even our identity so tightly, And instead of pinning our hopes on a better future, we focus on the present, and we're grateful for what's in front of us. And as I said earlier, we say, I love you more often.
Yeah.
Because we realize the importance of human connection. And so I think we become kinder and more compassionate, more forgiving of ourselves and each other.
Yeah.
I think the don't wait is a pathway to fulfillment, an antidote to regret, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. And you were talking about grieving, and I think this is an important point to bring up with the second invitation, that we welcome everything, push away nothing. I think there's a tendency to think, well, I don't want to approach this stuff until I'm at a place in my life where I can approach it, in a way that's going to not be too painful or something along those lines. But this invitation of welcoming everything includes welcoming the difficulty of encountering and dealing with death. I had an experience with one of my college buddies who ended up being a business partner with me in a business venture about four or 5 years ago. And out of the blue, he was diagnosed with stage 4 melanoma. And he was told he had months to live. And it ended up being about a year before he passed. But in that time, what used to be our Tuesday lunch meetings to talk about business turned into our Tuesday meetings to talk about life. And it was a fascinating experience to be able to talk to him about this process of what it feels like to be dying. But this thought of welcoming everything, pushing nothing away, there were moments where I noticed a resistance, especially towards the end of, I don't know if I want to go see him, because what do you say, to someone who's dying, and feelings like that. But then thinking, well, it's okay to just feel whatever I'm feeling with him, and to have those open conversations. And it turned into this beautiful experience where I have a good friend that the last time we met for lunch, I was able to give him a hug and thank him for our friendship, and thank him for the fun memories in college. And how often do we really get to do that? But that's what I thought of with this welcoming everything, welcoming the difficulty of it too.
Yeah, just to back up, just so that people understand the context here, the book is called 5 Invitations. And so an invitation is, if I invite you to my house for dinner or to my wedding, it's an invitation to show up, actually. It's a request for you to be present, really. And so the 5 invitations are just that. There are requests for you to be present. And what we're asking you to be present for is your life. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And each of these 5 invitations, you've named the first 2, really were given to me or taught to me by people who are dying, in one way or another, even if they didn't use that exact language. They helped me to really see that, this is not only a way to help take care of people at the end of life or as they're in the dying process, but these are really have a relevance for all of us in living a more, peaceful, meaningful, productive life, I think. So the first one, as you said, was don't wait. And the second one is welcome everything, push away nothing. Yeah, now that sounds really good. It's make a great bumper sticker, but like, how do we do that?
Mhm.
Welcome everything? Yeah. I mean, as you were suggesting, we like certainty, right? We like to have our preferences met. In fact, most of us have been taught that getting what we want and avoiding what we don't want is the key to happiness.
Mhm.
But inevitably in our lives, um, there are unexpected experiences, right? There are unanticipated moves, or we lose our job, or there's a family member who gets an illness, or there's a death of a beloved pet.
Mhm.
And we want to push these things away with all our might.
Mhm.
Um, when we're faced with uncertainty, the first response is usually fear and resistance.
Yeah.
But I think an attempt to evict these difficult aspects of life, from our everyday experience, is a kind of cause of suffering, actually, for us.
Mhm.
You know, um, mm, I think to instead, when we cultivate a kind of receptivity to whatever is present, they don't have such a stranglehold on us. I think when we're open and receptive, we have more options.
Mhm.
We're free to discover, to investigate, to learn how to respond to these things in skillful ways.
Mhm.
If our life was just about being comfortable, we would just give people morphine and put them on the couch.
Mhm.
They'd be really comfortable, but they wouldn't be very alive.
Mhm.
They wouldn't be very engaged with their lives.
Yeah.
So, with welcoming everything comes the ability to meet and work with both pleasant and unpleasant circumstances.
Mhm.
And I think gradually with practice, we discover that our well-being is not dependent on just having happy external reality. Our true happiness, our true contentment actually arises from within.
Yeah.
I mean, think about yourself, Noah. I mean, the changes in your life, the real growth that you've made in your life, it probably didn't happen in your comfort zones,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. In fact, I was
It-
just thinking as you were saying that I think some of the moments where I felt most alive were moments where I was experiencing perhaps the most pain I've ever felt or the most hurt. Those were moments that I felt, especially after the fact, looking back and thinking, those are the moments that really helped me those were pivotal moments in my life, the
Sure.
difficult moments.
Sure.
Yeah.
And it's not like we have to go hunting for them. They're there. I
Yeah.
mean, they're part of what life delivers to us in a way, as it does also deliver incredibly beautiful moments.
Hmm.
Um, but I think, this, to welcome everything and push away nothing, it's a deep invitation, you know, to cultivate a certain kind of fearless receptivity. Now, that doesn't mean you don't have any fear. That's people misunderstand fearlessness.
Hmm.
Fearlessness means that fear isn't the only thing in the room.
Hmm.
That when you're afraid, Noah, for example, let me ask you, when you're afraid, do you know that you're afraid?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. How do you know? Like, how do you know you're afraid?
Well, I mean, you feel it. There are physiological
Right.
symptoms,
Right.
and there's a strong aversion to
Uh-huh.
whatever it is.
Often.
Yeah.
Fear itself feels like an aversion. Yeah.
Hmm.
So there might be physical sensations, there's emotional associations that occur. The mind starts planning about the future or how to get out of this scary situation.
Hmm.
So all that's going on, right? But here's the thing I want to point you to, which is that when you know you're afraid, that means that some part of you is not afraid.
Hmm.
The part that knows you're afraid, that's aware of your fear, it's not afraid.
Yeah.
And we can orient to just the fear, or we can orient to this awareness, to this knowing, we could say. It doesn't mean the fear goes away. It doesn't mean we don't have to get it to go away.
Yeah.
Yeah. What we have to do is learn how to deal with it skillfully. So we're not running away from it and it whacks us in the back of the head.
Yeah. And I think
So I think
sometimes a considerable part of the suffering we experience is the wanting to get rid of it.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Most of what we call pain, even physical pain, is our resistance to it, the not wanting it to be there. That's the
Mhm.
real cause of suffering, right? Pain plus resistance equals suffering.
Yeah.
That's the formula we can understand.
Yeah. I had an
You know,
experience last summer talking about fear. I have what I consider an irrational fear of snakes. I understand that it's irrational, and I've tried to overcome it. It's really difficult for me. But there was a snake in the yard, and
mm,
I made the conscious decision it was a little garden snake. All the little kids were playing with it, all my nephews. And I said, I'm gonna go hold it. I'm gonna touch the snake and hold it and realize this is okay. the fear never went away in that process. The fear was there, but it's the observer that you're talking about. There was the part of me that could observe, I'm experiencing fear. It's okay. I understand that it's not necessarily rational, and I'm going to still proceed to do, what I'm going to do, which is hold this snake. And I was proud of myself after the fact for doing it. And people who know me well who were there were like, I can't believe you touched a snake, or that was brave. And I was thinking, well, if brave means I was very scared and still did it, then yes. But if brave means I finally lost my fear, no, that's not accurate.
Yeah, very good. That's a really good distinction. I think people imagine we're always talking about overcoming our fear, just as we talk about overcoming our grief. It's curious to me that we never speak about overcoming our joy.
Hmm.
We don't say, how do we manage our joy a little bit better?
Yeah.
I think that these experiences, fear, grief, these very strong mental, emotional states, are something we live into and that we learn something about. Openness doesn't reject or get attached to any particular experience or view.
Mm-hmm.
It's a spacious. Our awareness can have about it a certain spaciousness, undefended quality. Non-biased, allowing. We could say.
Mm-hmm.
Openness is the nature of awareness itself. It's the nature of our nature, actually.
Yeah.
And so I think this is one of the things that people often discover in and around the time of dying. This thing that they always imagine would be only terrifying or unbearable or unimaginably difficult, they find within themselves frequently the resources to meet what they thought was unbearable in remarkable ways.
Hmm.
And it isn't because all their fear went away. It's because they discovered they are not just their fear. Yeah.
Yeah.
They're not just their illness. They're not just their dying process. There's more to them than that. And it's not about a spiritual bypass, and it's not about spiritualizing the experience. It's recognizing more of who we are.
Hmm.
What's amazing to me, Noah, is not that we can expand. I mean, all of us can, through meditation practice and other ways, experience expansive states of mind and heart and body. What's amazing to me is that we take this expansiveness of who we are and shrink it down into such a small story about who we are.
Hmm.
That's what's amazing to me. And that's what gets blown out of the water in and around the time of dying, frequently for people. Yeah.
Yeah.
The habits of our life have a very strong momentum and they carry through into the time of our dying. And sometimes those habits can be really constricting. So we need to ask ourselves now, well, what habits do we want to create?
Mm-hmm.
What do we want to cultivate in this life? What do you want to teach your children?
Yeah.
So so going toward what frightens us or going toward the suffering is oftentimes where the healing is often found, like going and touching the snake.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think that's very relevant with the grieving process as well. After the fact, losing a loved one, and then dealing with that grief for it could be the rest of your life, or I think perhaps it is the rest of your life. And the misconception is that one day you'll be done. You get over it.
Mm,
and
mm,
and I see a lot of suffering arise out of that thought that this is a feeling that I'm supposed to overcome, like we were talking about with
mm.
fear, right? It's not that you overcome it, it's that you harmonize with it, you make it a part of the everyday.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to throw, when someone's in the middle of deep grief, they don't want to hear this,
Sure.
and it's easy to sort of throw conceptual, theoretical ideas at these experiences, which are gut wrenching. Um, I think what's true is that
Excuse me.
our relationship to grief, for example, shifts over time, but time alone doesn't heal grief. Time and attention heals grief.
Mm-hmm.
So in the beginning, we might feel like we don't know whether we should turn left or right at the end of our driveway. We can't make a meal. We're absolutely lost in the experience of grief. It's emotionally overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
And it can feel like sadness, of course, but it can also feel like anger, and it can feel like fear and numbness, and even relief. Those are all phases of grief.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't stay and it doesn't remain in that intensity forever. It starts to shift over time and with attention. So, after some weeks or months, and there's not a timetable for grief, but often with attention and time, it starts to relax a little bit. and our identity isn't completely consumed by the grief. And so we start to have a different relationship to it.
Mm-hmm.
But, the experience, what you're saying, I think, which is true, is that grief is part of the human condition. It's there for all of us. And it surfaces sometimes, it's like an underground river that surfaces sometimes, like, for example, around the loss of someone we love. But it's always been there. In fact, I think it's our common ground with one another, one of our common grounds.
Sure.
And the experience of grief, which feels like fragmentation and isolation, with time and attention and healing, can become a path to wholeness. But you can't tell somebody that at the beginning of their grieving process. All you can do is hang out with them and, make a meal for them and help them do the insurance forms and have them tell the story of their loss 10,000 times until
Sure.
it feels real for them.
Yeah.
So I think that, when I was running Zen Hospice, I'm not anymore, but when I was the director there, I sometimes lost 20 or 30 people in a week. And so I had to learn how to deal with that grief. And so one of the things I did was I went to my meditation cushion, and that was a way to cultivate stability and assimilate, metabolize, if you will, the experience of loss. But that wasn't enough. Grief is a physical experience also. So I would go to my body worker.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd go in his office and he'd say, "Where should we touch today, Frank?" And instead of him doing some kind of manipulation on me, I'd say, "Just here on my shoulder," and he'd put his hand on my shoulder, and I would just cry for about an hour. And there was something about the touch and also the relationship with somebody else that allowed this grief to really come forward and to be expressed and as a way of metabolizing it,
Mm-hmm.
including it. And then I did something else. I would go to the hospital nearby where my friends worked in the maternity ward, the nurses on the maternity ward. And on that particular maternity ward, there were babies who were born to addicted mothers. And so before I would go home to my own children, I would go there to this maternity ward, and I would sit in a rocking chair and rock these little infants, And there was something about being able to soothe their distress and have them relax in my arms that was very important and very helpful to me, because there were other times when I was with people who were dying whose, frankly, suffering I couldn't soothe. I couldn't. They died in difficult conditions. And so I had to find ways to work with that grief that really worked for me. And each person's grief is entirely different. And I'm a little suspicious of models of grief, that we have us managing people's experience. I think there's a wonderful, great value to things like bereavement groups, et cetera, but sometimes they don't allow for the wildness of grief. And grief can be completely wild,
Mm-hmm.
feel uncontrollable.
Yeah.
And it can have a huge effect on the way in which we function in the world. It used to be, in the old days, it used to be that there was you wore a special kind of clothing or a black armband or something to let people know that you're in an altered state,
Mm-hmm.
and that they should treat you different. They shouldn't expect you to behave normally,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, now your mother dies and you go to a party and nobody mentions it,
Yeah.
because we're afraid to upset you.
Mm-hmm.
And so we leave you isolated and alone in your grief. Yeah. So I think that, again, the book, but also my work, and I think it sounds like your way also, is to help people turn toward their experience,
Mm-hmm.
even if the experience first feels unnerving in some way.
Yeah.
Stay with it, stay in the room when the going gets rough. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. I have a question that somebody posted,
Uh-huh.
and this is Johnny, and he's asking, is it fair to say that when we experience fear, we might want to take a step back and try to find if there's an opportunity hiding behind it?
Well, I think that's true. I think it's a wise comment. The only thing that I would want to encourage us to do is to not do a bypass around the fear, to be willing to feel it, to see, as you did earlier, sense it in the body, feel the effect in the heart, mood, etc., and to see what the activity is in the mind that's occurring, so that we get really familiar with the fear.
Mm-hmm.
I think also when we get very familiar with it in that way, we can see it in its arising, before it's in its full explosion, before it's in its full bloom, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, yes, what Johnny's suggesting, to take a backward step, to step back then from all of that activity of mind, heart, and body, and say, oh, what else is here? That's my favorite question. What else is here?
Yeah.
So in addition to the fear and my my reaction to it. Well, what else is here? Oh, well, oh, there's some spaciousness here. Oh, there's some understanding that's growing here. Oh, there's some, empathy that's emerging here. So to ask that simple question, what else is here, I think is a wise way to interact with almost any difficult emotional or mind state. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. One other question that somebody commented, and this is kind of a different topic, but I think this might be a fun little tangent or segue to explore here. Um, this is Derek who's asking, some speculate that we will at some point reach a time when science will be able to extend our lives indefinitely so that
Mm,
we could effectively live forever.
mm.
How does Frank think this removal of death would affect us?
That's becoming an increasingly popular question. And I was with a group of Silicon Valley folks not long ago, and I said something like, "Death is inevitable." And the guy raised his hand and he said, "Oh, I'm not so sure about that. We're trying to hack that right now,
Yeah.
And I said, "Okay, great." And I said, "So we'll live for 250 years or we'll live for 500 years." And, I said, "Let's take the word death out of the equation for a moment. Let's just take it out of the conversation. And let's just deal with how we think about endings. Like, how do we meet endings in our life right now? Like the end of a sentence
Hmm.
or the end of a meal. Or when you leave a party, like, how do you leave the party? Do you just ghost out, or do you say goodbye to people? How do you meet endings? I think the way in which we meet endings can, in fact, have a big influence on how the next moment arises. You know, the way we end one thing tends to shape the way the next thing emerges. So I think that if we could think just for a moment, let go of the notion of death as a particular, some final event, and just think about endings, you know, well, that's a really good place to explore. Because
Yeah,
even if we live forever, there will be endings. There will be
sure.
endings continuously through that experience. So, that's not going to, even if we live forever,
Yeah.
there will be endings.
Well, I was thinking
My,
as you
my,
were
my teacher
saying
used
that.
to, I'm sorry, I just wanted to add one more thing, which was
Sure.
that my teacher used to say, suppose you could live forever, no matter what. You know, when we talk about living forever, we assume we're going to be in great health the entire time.
Hmm.
Now, maybe that's not so. You
Yeah.
know, I mean, I think that we were talking earlier about impermanence. I think we rely on impermanence.
Yeah.
I think it's not only what shows us beauty; it's also something that gives us relief. I mean, that really boring dinner party that you're going to go to on Saturday night, it's going to end.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or this cold that you have, it's going to end. Or you know, evil dictatorships will fall
Yeah.
and hopefully be replaced by thriving democracies. You
Yeah.
know, so we rely on things coming to an end. I think.
Yeah, I agree. And I was gonna say the stages like we had talked about before, those are stages that end. Presuming I could plan on living forever, there would
Mm,
be stages of life that have ended, and
right.
memories I think fit into that because even now, I don't remember the 5-year-old me. What did I feel? What did I think? I don't even remember the specific experiences that I was having. So in a way,
Mm,
that part of me is dead and gone. Um, so if we reach this point where we can live forever, uh, 2,000 years from now, is that me going to be significantly different than the me that was talking to you here today? Would I grieve that old me? I don't know, but I think you're right. There would always be the opportunity to still uh, live fully by keeping in mind the endings that life will always be having, the phases and the stages and the
yeah.
friendships and
Yeah.
relationships, so many other endings.
I mean, I think the question is an interesting one philosophically, and what does that do to the structure of the society, et cetera, if people live forever? I don't know. I can't imagine knowing that. The thing that I would want to be careful of is that we won't use a question like that to bypass our direct experience that we're having now. You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
the fact of the matter is now we don't live for 2,000 years.
Yeah.
We live for a limited lifespan. And then, so I want to know, okay, how do I do that really well?
Yeah.
How do I do that with as much integrity and as much passion and as much, joy and fullness as I can muster? And how
Yeah.
do I love just as hard as I possibly can this
Yeah.
life that is fragile and
Yeah.
vulnerable?
Well, one of the things that I just thought of, there are ideologies and religious views that are built around the idea of this being a perpetual experience. Sure, life ends, but then you continue to exist and in an eternal state somewhere else, let's say heaven or
Mm,
something like that.
mm,
And what I found for me, looking back to when I viewed it that way, was it can be easy to bypass the present experience in anticipation of, well, that future experience, then things will be better. But right now, you know, uh, I won't do what I need to do to change my life now because I am projecting it to the future. And I think this thought of extending our ability to live forever can do the same thing. It can remove us from the full experience of being mindful in this moment, the only true moment that we have, the present.
mm. Yes, and look, there's 1,000 ways to distract ourselves,
Mhm.
and that's just one of them, but there's also it's kind of fun and playful to play with. Oh well, what if, that those are fun
Sure.
things to play with. I like my mind's ability to imagine, and I don't know what happens after we die. No, I just don't. Maybe maybe all the things that religions have been telling us for millenniums will in fact be so. I think what tends to happen is we tend to take our sense of self, which for the most part we construct as something separate and apart from everything else,
Yeah.
and we imagine that continuing forever. Now, that I don't imagine happens. This personality isn't, thank goodness, is not going to go on forever.
Mhm.
Um, and so I think when we live in that way, it's both a little absurd to me and also a little arrogant. I mean, here's what we usually do, which is everything is changing, right? Like your 8-year-old son told you, right?
Yeah.
Oh, caterpillars turn into butterflies, Dad, and seasons come and go. Everything is constantly changing except me.
Mhm.
Like I'm the one thing in all
Yeah.
of reality
Mhm.
that doesn't change. And we have that idea, about ourselves oftentimes, and it's absurd.
Yeah.
And for me, it's also, like when I see someone I haven't seen in many years, and they say, "Oh, Frank, it's great to see you. You haven't changed a bit." I'm a little insulted, actually, because I think there's been a lot of change in my life, over these 66 years. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So the fact is, uh, death is not this thing that only happens at the end of a long road. It's happening right now.
Mhm.
This podcast will come to an end.
Yeah.
My sentence will come to an end.
Yeah. With that, I want to touch on the topic of uncertainty. And I think a lot of our discomfort arises out of what you mentioned before. I don't know what happens when I die. And what if we were okay with saying, oh, well, that's a perfectly acceptable answer? We don't know. It seems like we're so uncomfortable with uncertainty that we feel the need to construct a certain narrative, even if it's just a narrative or it's fictional, but at least it's certain. And we do this with not just thinking about death, but an example I use often. We do this when we're driving and someone cuts us off. It's not okay for me to not know why that happened. I feel much more certain when I say, "Oh, that person's a jerk. That's why they did that." I may be
Yeah.
completely wrong, but at least I've got an answer now. And I wonder if our ability to increase our comfort around the discomfort of not knowing, what effect that would have on bigger topics like the topic of death.
Hmm. Well, or climate change, or any number of other social issues that we have. I
Hmm.
mean, I think the problem lies not in uncertainty, but the fact that we fill not knowing with scary ideas, scary thoughts, or the opposite of faith. We often say is not doubt. It's certainty. Yeah.
Mm.
So there's a beautiful Buddhist teacher, Carol Hyman, and she wrote very beautifully. She said, if we learn to let go into uncertainty and to trust that our basic nature and that of the world are not different, then the fact that things are not solid and fixed, this becomes a liberating opportunity rather than a threat. I
I
mean,
like that.
everything will come apart, Noah. This is true of our bodies, of our relationships, of our life. It's happening all the time anyway. It's not just at the end when the curtain falls. Coming
Yeah.
together inevitably means parting. Don't be troubled by this. This is the
Mhm.
nature of life.
Yeah.
Our lives are not solid and fixed. no matter how much we try to protect ourselves and make white picket fences around our houses, you know.
Hmm.
And I think knowing this intimately is how we prepare for death, also for any loss of any kind. And it's also how we really come to love and fully embrace constant change.
Yeah.
We're not just our past, we're becoming, you know, we're not stuck. We don't have to be stuck in old grudges, you know, we can forgive, you know, we can free ourselves from resentment and regret now
Yeah.
before we die. Yeah.
One of the a common question I get when I'm exploring this topic in a workshop or somewhere is if you have this mindset of just being anchored in the present moment, um, do you run the risk of becoming indifferent to things in the future? Like, oh, I guess I'm not going to
Mhm.
pursue this career path because who knows where things will go now.
Mhm.
Is that a risk that we run? And I have the answer I typically give for that, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on this idea.
I think initially it certainly is a risk. I mean, I know for myself, when I first got introduced to notions of impermanence, I used it kind of as a club, you know.
Mhm.
It was a way to not invest in anything, you know, in my relationships, in my early relationships. I thought, well, it's all impermanent. Why invest here? You know, why
Mhm.
commit to anything? But of course, it's just the opposite. It's because things are impermanent, because they are so precarious that they're so precious. That's why we love them so much, you know. That's why we really want to invest completely, you know, not in some clinging, you know, craving way, but in a way that really honors and respects the fact that, you know, all relationships are characterized by constant change.
Mhm.
So I think that that's the first thing. Yeah, we can use it as a kind of defense against commitment and engagement. Um, but the other is that it's kind of freeing. It means that we're not wedded to our past trauma. You know, we're not wedded to our, you know, future scary stories. You know, the other thing I want to add here, Noah, which I think is vastly misunderstood, is we often, and in Buddhist practice, is subject to this problem, which is that we talk about the present moment as if it were like some nanosecond in time. You know,
Mhm.
and was that it? Did we just miss it? You know, I think the present moment has to be understood to include past and future. You know,
Mhm.
the now is not a long, eternity is not a long, long time. You know, St. Augustine wrote about this. He said, the now is neither in time nor out of time. So when we speak about the present moment, we're talking about a moment that includes past and future, not that um, avoids it. When I'm remembering my third grade teacher, but I'm remembering her now, that's a present moment activity. You know, when I'm
Mhm.
thinking about how I'll be when I'm really old, that's a present moment activity. Yeah. So it's not like you know, past and future an illusion. I think that's a misunderstanding. I think all of it exists here and now. Yeah.
Yeah.
That means that we have access to an awful lot here and now.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that.
And it means
Um,
that we can fully invest, you know, without fear. Yeah.
yeah. Taking this concept and applying it in the present moment, I want to ask you about people who are currently going through a difficult stage. For
Mm.
example, dealing with, let's say, a child with mental health issues or
Mm.
suicidal thoughts, or the difficulties of dealing with the possibility of death and feeling helpless. That uh, I think in scenarios like that.
Mm.
Um, Part of the difficulty is recognizing the pain and suffering that a loved one is experiencing and wanting to remove that from them. And
Mm.
talk to me a little bit about that. What tips or advice would
Mm.
you give to someone who's going through a situation like that?
Well, I'm careful about advice, you know, because it's cheap and you know, it's hard to give generalized advice, you know, without knowing the
Absolutely.
specifics of a situation. But I would say that one of the things that is helpful for me to keep in the back of my mind and heart as I'm with someone in such a situation is that to build an empathetic bridge to them, I have to be willing to look at my own relationship to these issues. So I have to look at my own helplessness. I have to look at my own fear. I have to look at my own grief, right?
Hmm.
Otherwise, when I'm with them and I say I understand, they will know I'm just guessing, you know, so they'll sniff out my sentimentality and my insincerity. And so in order to really be of service to others, I have to work on myself. And that's what enables me to be of service to others. And of course, serving others, I learn more about myself. I grow and develop for myself. So there's that mutuality of exchange that happens.
Mm-hmm.
But the other thing that I think is a misunderstanding is that we often, well, there's a lot of language out there around the confusion between empathy and compassion these days. Empathy
Mm-hmm.
is that I feel with. Compassion is the action to do something to remove or alleviate the suffering.
Mm-hmm.
But so we can get empathetically overloaded with people, even our own children. You know, we
Mm-hmm.
need to feel with them, but we also, if I'm with my granddaughter and she's having a, tantrum, I need to know that I can stay in my own seat, and I can use
Mm-hmm.
my wisdom and I can use my maturity and I can use my kind heart to comfort her. If I get over there and get
Mm-hmm.
lost in the tantrum with her, I can't be of very much use. Or if I'm only in the action to her tantrum, I can't be of very much use.
Yeah.
So I have to really keep my own seat. That's what I have to do.
Mm-hmm.
Now, compassion um, often is spoken about rather as taking away suffering or removing suffering, and that's good if you can do it, but you can't always do it. I work with dying people, and I can't take away their dying. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But what I find is that when I'm really abiding in a compassionate heart, that means that I've really done my homework. Then they sense that, and they're willing to go to really dangerous places. Not
Mm-hmm.
not because it's going to be safe eventually. It's because they're companioned. They're compassionately companioned. Yeah. And so I think we underestimate sometimes the value of simple human presence, particularly compassionate human presence, radical compassion that doesn't always know what to do. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's willing to be with the suffering. It's willing to stay in the room when the going gets rough. And I think what happens is when compassion's there, and just one more thing on this, when compassion is present, our defenses against what's difficult fall down. And then we
Mm-hmm.
can see the deeper causes of the suffering. And then we can actually intervene ourselves or help another to intervene in their experience in a skillful way. So compassion
Yeah.
does more than just take away things. It allows us to stay with something until a deeper truth can show itself. The actual truth of the real suffering can show itself. And then we can do something about it.
Yeah, I like that. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that touches on the second invitation of welcoming everything and pushing away nothing, recognizing that situations like that, there may not be answers. And so you're with that person and knowing that, hey, this is going to be a rough ride. I don't know what to say. I don't know what to do, but I'm here with you. And uh, I think we can add. It's already a moment of difficulty, but we can add to it by adding that second arrow, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're there thinking this isn't how this should feel. There should be an answer. There should be something that solves this whole problem, and sometimes there's not.
No, and the answer isn't always to solve the problem. Sometimes the answer is in simply keeping company with people. I've been with some people in really horrible conditions, and I couldn't do much to make those conditions go away. But in fact,
Yeah,
I could keep company with them. I
yeah,
think it also is useful not to just imagine that to use our skillful action, to use our wise hearts in action. I remember coming into a situation where there was a patient who was very sick, coming close to the end of life, and the volunteer was there. And I said, "How's it going?" And she said, "Well, she's having a really hard time, but we're just being with it." And she was in this kind of meditative pose. And I looked at
hmm,
sweating up a storm, and I said, "Well, it's good that you're being with her, but let's get a cool rag. Let's cool down her forehead. And get her some ibuprofen because that will help with the fever. So we want to make skillful interventions as well, when they seem appropriate. So,
yeah,
we want to use our intelligence and our good, kind hearts, and together they make for a very reliable guide. Yeah.
yeah. I like that. Do you have any specific meditation techniques, or are there meditations that facilitate with this idea of becoming more mindful of death? It looks like I may have lost the signal there from Frank. I'll give it a moment and see if he.
Are we still
There
there?
you are.
Oh, I almost lost you
Yeah.
there. Sorry. You started to say something and then I lost your audio.
Okay. Yeah. So my question was, do you know of any, are there any meditative techniques or guided meditations that help us to be more mindful of death? I'm thinking something like, meta meditation for kindness and compassion. Is there something that's the equivalent that deals with thinking about death?
Sure, there's lots of them, there are various visualization practices, visualizing one's own dying. There's mm, there are these kinds of practices that we can do, but I think it's best to keep it simple, and really look and see what happens at the end of an exhale. What happens there in that gap between the next inhale. That's a moment, right? It's a moment of faith or a moment of fear. Do you really trust the next breath will arise and that you'll be able to work with it? Or are you afraid that it won't come and you feel like you have to manage it? Yeah. So I think that learning to be simple in our lives and deal with our everyday life, not thinking of some other meditation outside of our life, but, just before going to bed at night, reflecting on one's own day, looking back and seeing with gratitude, what this day was like, and about is important. My wife asks, and I sometimes before we go to sleep, we ask each other 4 questions. I just want to be sure you're still there, Noah. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm still
The
here.
4 questions are given to me by another friend, Angela Sarian. The first one is, what inspired you today? Yeah, beautiful. Second question is, what challenged you today? Because we don't just grow in our comfort zones, as we spoke earlier. And the third one is, what surprised you today? That's a really good one. Children love surprises. You can play peekaboo with my granddaughter, and she 10,000 times, and she loves it. But throw a surprise party for an adult, and they say, "Who's responsible for this?" So, what surprised you today? And the last one is, what did you learn about love today? That's a beautiful question to ask. So, what inspired you? What challenged you? What surprised you? And what did you learn about love today? These were a great practice taught to me by a dear friend, Angelos Arian, who died a few years ago. So those are practices, I think, that help us, wouldn't they be the great questions to ask as we come close to the end of our life, and why not practice them now?
Yeah.
So,
Well, I noticed a question just popped in, and I know we're kind of getting towards the end of the hour. So I just wanted to extend the invitation to anyone who's listening. If you have any questions that you would like to ask, now would be a great time to post them. And one already did. This is Johnny asking, how important is closure before death?
Well, it's an ideal to try and come to, but I'm a little suspicious of our ideas of closure, which is that everything gets wrapped up nice and neat and tidy. My experience is that you close this and the next thing opens. And so what I was saying earlier about watching the way we meet endings is really useful. Some people come to the end of their lives and they have meaningful conversations with family or friends or people that perhaps they've had challenges with. And that's really helpful for them to step into their dying process. For others, that's a more of an internal process, and they come to that understanding, within themselves, not through relational conversations. So I think what I'm really want to be careful of is that we don't set up a kind of idealistic idea about what has to happen for death. One of the things that happens in this culture is we put a lot of weight on dying people to do it well, or to die well, or to have a good death, or all those things, instead of recognizing that when we speak about a good death, we might not know what that actually is like internally and spiritually for someone. We don't really know what it is that we need next oftentimes. What I think we can do is look at the systems and say, did the system support this person in a way that really helped them, or did the system abandon them? We can evaluate the system and help us really look and see how to do that, how to help people when they're dying better. But I don't think it's so helpful to evaluate people's way of dying as as a way of understanding what a good death is. I've seen people die, opening in great kindness, and I've also seen people die telling the people in front of them that they hate them. And both of them, in my view, were actually appropriate to those individuals. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, thank you for clarifying that, because I agree with you on that view. I think it's dangerous when we start to decide what is a good death, what
Yeah.
is a bad death.
Well, again, I think we can say something about the system and how do we, from our healthcare system or other systems, how are we supporting this person?
Yeah,
Did we take care of their symptoms? Did we manage their pain? Did we, you know, um, give them a certain degree of autonomy? What do we do?
yeah.
Those are things that we should evaluate, I think. Yeah.
And I think if we were to take that and flip it to what is a good life, what is a bad life, we can run into some of those same issues. But ending this on a note where we're talking about life, because your book has these invitations,
Mm.
but the ultimate premise is that we're discovering what death can teach us about fully living.
Yes.
So ending it on that note with this concept of what it means to be fully living, what do you have to say with regards to the concept of fully living? What does that look like?
Well, of course, it's going to look individually quite different to different people.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's part of the beauty of this incredibly beautiful opportunity we call life. Um, that said, I think that living a life that is multidimensional, I think, is really a good way to think about it. Our life doesn't proceed in a linear way. It's, living it on the horizontal, but also on the vertical, we could say.
Mm-hmm.
Those two planes of existence, if you will, I think are really important to consider. Um, you know, um, i- i- is it a life characterized by integrity? Is it a life characterized by meaning and purpose? Is it a life that includes or aims at belonging? Yeah. These are the really big questions that really matter for us. Do we find ourselves, do we recognize the interdependency of our lives? That everything we do and say affects everything else and everyone else. And that we are, affected and supported by everything else that happens in reality. So I think full life is a life that's fully lived is a life that begins to recognize these things as well, and tempers our notions of control. I think that's really important to conclude as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's great. I've really enjoyed talking to you about this topic, and I'm like I mentioned before, I'm grateful that you took the time to make this appointment work to be able to
Yeah.
jump on live with someone you've never talked to, and to spend an hour with me talking about such an important topic, a topic that at some point uh, brushes up against every single one of us.
Well, it's brushing up against us right now, Noah. You know what I mean? It's not like it's just something happens at the end of, a long, long
Mhm.
life. It's here in this moment, right? This podcast is about to come to an end, right?
Yeah,
So
it
how do we
really
meet
is.
it? I want to
Yeah.
end it by saying thank you. I really want to say thank you to you for doing it, first of all, and for inviting me to be your guest and to, engage people in such a lively conversation. I don't think my book or my life is about just preparing for dying. I think that's a short-lived understanding. I think it's how do we use death, the presence of death, to really help us see what matters most in this life. And inevitably, and most of the people I've worked with who are dying, they've asked two questions, Noah. Not, big philosophical questions. They're more questions like, am I loved? And did I love
Mhm.
well? Yeah. Those are the two questions that come to people's hearts and minds as they come to the end of their life. And we don't need to wait until death to ask ourselves those questions or to answer them. We can do it now.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
I want to leave your listeners and viewers with that reflection. You want a reflection on death? Ask yourself those two questions. Yeah.
I love that. And I would add that for me, the five invitations are absolutely invitations about life.
Mm.
Like you said, it's a book that uses death as the topic to really talk about life. It's a book about life, and quite a powerful book. Um, So if you're interested in learning about the 5 invitations in Frank Ostaseski's book, you can pick that up, I'm sure, on Amazon. I will be posting a link to it on the interview that I'm doing. This interview will be transcribed, so for those who want to reread it or listen to it or watch it, all of those links will be posted, and I'll share that with you, Frank,
Can
once
I
I
add
have
one
that
more
up.
thing, if I may, Noah?
Absolutely.
One is I now continue to direct an organization called the Metta Institute, METTA Institute.org. They can find us on the web, or they can go to 5invitations.com, and they can find not only information about the book, but lots of articles and podcasts and other things that help people in different domains of their life. People working with grief, healthcare professionals that want to know more about how to be a mindful healthcare professionals, people who want to be compassionate companions in their life, people who want to just step into life more fully. There are articles, blogs, all kinds of stuff on the site that we made available just as a gift to the world, so people can find it there on 5invitations.com. And the other is that, I'm not very good at self-promotion, but I want to encourage people to look at the book or to get the audiobook, which I read, because I think it's not just this good self-exploration, but it's a great conversation to have with people you care about. And the book is a really interesting way to have that conversation. People are doing it in book clubs and such, but get a couple for the holidays as gifts, and have the conversation with your family. Talk to your parents, talk to your kids about this,
Yeah.
There isn't a more important conversation.
And I want to endorse that message, because I wouldn't have you on the podcast if I hadn't read the book, and if I didn't think the book was of tremendous value to anyone who's going to read it. So yes, I read the book. I wholeheartedly recommend it to especially the podcast listeners, who are typically people who are trying to do exactly that: live more fully, live more mindfully. Death is a great way to do that. The way Frank presents that is wonderful. I listened to it on Audible, and I don't know if you noticed in this last hour, it's a pleasant experience to hear Frank talk, and that's who reads the book. So if you're going to read it by listening to it, that's another plus. It's actually Frank who's reading it. But are there any other sites that you would want to point people to if they want to follow you or your thoughts? Do you have a Twitter account or anything like that?
Yeah, they can find me on Twitter. It's F. Ostaseski or 5invitations. And if they go to the websites, they can find events and things. We're just posting the stuff for 2018 now, but they can find out where I'm teaching around the country, around the world for that matter. I teach all over the world. So there'll be more information after January 1st on those sites. Yeah. But thank you, Noah. Thank you again.
Awesome.
And really appreciate the conversation and, the directness with which you engaged me. Thank you.
Thank you. And I will stay in touch with you by email. And I would love to maybe have the opportunity to have another conversation at some point in the future.
Happy to. Really happy to.
Okay. Well, happy holidays. Thanks again. And thank you to everyone who listened in live. And we will catch you guys next time. Until next time.